For some people who grew up in the 1970s, silence was learned, not chosen. They explained themselves once, then again, and nothing changed. Understanding didn't follow clarity, so they stopped speaking, not from anger, but from recognition. In a world that valued endurance over explanation, silence felt efficient, cleaner than repeating yourself, safer than being misunderstood. People who grew up in the 1970s were shaped by an environment where emotional explanation was rarely encouraged. Life emphasized stability, routine, and responsibility. Adults were busy surviving economic pressure, social change, and uncertainty. Children were expected to adapt quietly, not narrate their inner worlds. In that context, explaining how you felt often seemed unnecessary or even inappropriate. Feelings were considered distractions from doing what needed to be done. If something was difficult, the expectation was endurance, not articulation. You learned early that functioning mattered more than expressing. This wasn't cruelty, it was efficiency. Time was limited, energy was conserved, conversations focused on outcomes, not emotions. When a child struggled, the response was often correction or instruction, not curiosity. As a result, explanation began to feel optional. You were trained to observe, adjust, and move on. Meaning was something you carried internally, not something you shared outwardly. Over time, silence became associated with competence. The ability to carry things without comment was respected. Explaining yourself felt like slowing things down. Silence felt aligned with the rhythm of the world you were raised in. Many people from this generation remember the moment they realized that explaining themselves changed nothing. When they tried to clarify their feelings, the response was rarely understanding. Instead, they were told they were exaggerating, overthinking, or creating unnecessary complications. Explanation became linked with correction. The more you tried to explain, the more you were reshaped by someone else's interpretation. What you meant was often replaced by what others decided you should mean. This experience taught an important psychological lesson. Vulnerability did not guarantee safety. Speaking openly did not bring relief. It invited judgment. Over time, people learned to protect themselves by offering less. Silence reduced friction. It avoided debates that never led anywhere. It preserved dignity in situations where words were repeatedly dismissed. Eventually, silence stopped feeling like suppression. It felt like clarity, a way to remain intact when explanation only led to erosion. What looked like withdrawal from the outside was often a calculated response, not disengagement, but self-preservation. A quiet decision to stop offering meaning to spaces that never truly received it. Silence, for many who grew up in the 1970s, was never accidental. It was learned through repetition. Each time explanation led to misunderstanding, silence proved safer. Say-in. This silence was not withdrawal from the world, it was a way of staying intact within it. By limiting what they shared, people retained control over how much of themselves others could access. Silence became a filter, not a void. Choosing silence allowed emotions to remain unaltered by external interpretation. Feelings stayed personal, unedited, and unnegotiated. Over time, this strategy became automatic. When situations felt emotionally unsafe or unreceptive, silence activated immediately. It required no conscious decision. It was simp. What outsiders often mistook for distance or indifference was actually careful self-management. Silence functioned as armor, light enough to carry daily, strong enough to, when explanation feels unsafe, meaning doesn't disappear, it moves inward. People begin to process experiences privately, turning thoughts over internally rather than sharing them aloud. Decisions are made quietly. Reactions are measured before they surface. This internalization creates a strong inner framework. Individuals develop clarity about what they feel and what they value, even if they rarely verbalize it. Their sense of direction comes from within rather than from external feedback. However, this inward orientation also creates distance. Others are rarely invited into the full reasoning behind actions or choices. The inner world becomes rich but largely invisible. Over time, this can lead to a sense of being understood only by oneself. Communication becomes efficient but minimal. There is little impulse to explain unless the result is a life that appears quiet. For many people shaped by the 1970s, words came to feel unreliable. Once spoken, they could be questioned, reframed, or used against the speaker. Explanations were rarely received as they were intended. They were interpreted through assumptions, power dynamics, or impatience. Silence, in contrast, felt uncontaminated. It could not be misquoted or corrected. It carried no obligation to defend or justify. In silence, meaning remained whole. This created a quiet association between honesty and restraint. Speaking less felt more truthful than offering explanations that would be distorted anyway. Silence preserved authenticity by keeping inner meaning intact. Over time, sharing became selective. Words were saved for moments when accuracy truly mattered. Everywhere else, silence felt sufficient. This was not secrecy, it was discernment. Meaning did not vanish, it simply stopped being negotiated. Silence became a way to remain aligned with oneself in environments where words no longer felt safe or respected. Explaining oneself requires emotional energy. It demands attention, patience, and the willingness to be exposed. For many people in the 1970s, emotional resources were limited. Life asked for endurance, not elaboration. As a result, people learned to ration expression. They spoke only when consequences were real or unavoidable. Every explanation carried a cost, and unnecessary spending felt risky. Silence became an economical choice. It conserved emotional energy for survival, responsibility, and stability. Speaking was reserved for situations that truly required it. However, this economy had consequences. Over time, even safe spaces could feel undeserving of explanation. The habit of silence spread beyond its original purpose. What began as efficiency slowly became default. The voice remained intact but unused, not lost, simply stored away. This emotional restraint kept people functioning, but it also narrowed the range of connection. Silence protected energy, yet quietly reduced how much of the inner self could be shared. As adults, many people shaped by this early silence communicate with precision rather than abundance. They choose words carefully, often using fewer than expected. Their speech is direct, efficient, and rarely ornamental. They avoid over-explaining not because they lack depth, but because they learned that excess explanation invites distortion. In conversations, they listen more than they speak. When they do speak, it is usually after internal clarity has already been reached. There is little need to think aloud. Decisions are presented as conclusions, not processes. This communication style is often misunderstood. Others may perceive them as distant, reserved, or emotionally unavailable. In reality, these individuals are deeply self-contained. Their silence reflects discipline, not absence. They are comfortable with pauses. They do not rush to fill space with reassurance or justification. For them, silence is part of communication, not a failure of it. What appears minimal on the surface is supported by extensive inner processing. Their words are few because much has already happened internally. Silence, however, is rarely interpreted accurately by others. Many people assume it signals agreement, indifference, or a lack of thought. For those who rely on verbal affirmation, silence can feel unsettling or dismissive. Yet for individuals shaped by this pattern, silence often marks a boundary. It is a quiet signal that explanation is not being offered in this space. The boundary is not announced or defended. It is simply enacted through restraint. This can create tension in relationships. Others may push for clarification, assuming silence hides confusion or avoidance. In response, the silent individual may retreat further, reinforcing the boundary rather than explaining it. The misunderstanding is mutual. One side sees silence as absence, the other experiences it as protection. Over time, these unspoken boundaries shape interactions. Conversations remain polite, functional, and contained. Depth is possible, but only where silence is respected rather than challenged. When you rarely explain yourself, you also rarely experience being fully understood. Others may know your actions, your routines, even your reliability, but not the reasoning beneath them. Relationships function, but they remain partial. Connection exists, yet it stops short of intimacy. Conversations stay on the surface not because depth is unavailable, but because access is limited. The inner world remains protected, but also unseen. For many, this does not register as loneliness. It feels familiar, a quiet distance that has always been there. Being not fully known becomes normal, even comfortable. Yet over time, a subtle cost emerges. Moments arise when understanding would matter, not for validation, but for resonance. In those moments, the absence of shared meaning becomes noticeable. The individual remains composed, but something remains unshared. not because it cannot be spoken, but because the habit of silence is already in place. This cost is rarely dramatic. It accumulates quietly like unexpressed sentences that never quite leave the body. Choosing silence in the 1970s was often adaptive. It reduced conflict, preserved autonomy, and protected inner clarity. Silence functioned as a skill, one that allowed people to navigate environments unreceptive to explanation. However, adaptation can harden into default. What once served a purpose may continue long after conditions change. Silence, once chosen, becomes automatic. Understanding this pattern does not demand constant explanation. It asks for awareness, the ability to recognize when silence is serving intention and when it is simply inherited behavior. When silence is chosen consciously, it remains powerful. It protects boundaries and honors inner truth. When silence operates unconsciously, it can limit connection and expression without being noticed. The difference is not volume, it is authorship. Silence, when owned, is strength. Silence, when unexamined, quietly decides for you.